Hi, my name is Frank Schaefer. I am an author and commentator, and I grew up in an evangelical background, left, consider myself now, I guess, progressive left of center, but still someone who asks questions about everything that I've experienced and that I read. I have a podcast in conversation with Frank Schaefer, commentaries that I do on It Has to Be Said, a book club, It Has to Be Read, and so forth. And I talk with a lot of authors of wonderful books, some of which are bestsellers. And it's a great privilege to read these books and talk with the authors that I interview. But all these books ask questions about some particular ideology or a historical trend, whether that's feminism or fascism or communism or democracy. And they all tend to avoid asking what I think is actually the overarching, basic human question. And this question is bigger than ideology, religion, or politics. It's bigger than gender. It's bigger than race. It's bigger than any single issue or any single question. I think it is the basic question of all human existence. And I don't have an answer for it. But I'll tell you what the question is. It's this. Why is it that no matter how you look at human actions, one thing is very clear, and that is our intellectual capacity, our ability to reason, our consciousness itself seems to have outrun our ability to emotionally process this consciousness. The result of this is that everything we do, even good things, eventually devolves into extremism. We seem to be unable to say no to ourselves about anything that we do, say, write, believe, or become. It's worth looking at this again, put a slightly different way. Why is it that always but always we tend to extremism? Why is it that our emotional maturity to process our consciousness lags so far behind that consciousness itself? We seem incapable of handling our own brain power. We seem incapable of reining in our ability to spin theories and ideas, be they religious or political, about everything and anything. And the result of this is that every single movement in history, every political or religious iteration, spins into some form of extremism in some or all of its parts. Read the rhetoric of all the feminists writing in the 60s and 70s, and so much made so much sense. But then, of course, at the margins, you have an extreme that literally borders on some kind of insanity, calling for an overthrow of motherhood, an overthrow of human relationships. The same goes for democracy itself. When it was founded in our country by white men who did not allow women to vote and owned slaves, and who were such hypocrites, at the same time were so reasonable, but in their own lives, Jefferson in particular, for instance, were unable to translate that reasonable intellectual ethic into a life that, for instance, in Jefferson's case, would have said, look, if I believe these things theoretically, do I have the emotional empathy to rein in my lust for my 14-year-old slave. And instead of impregnating her and raping her and dragging her along with me as a companion to France, say no to myself. Once again, our intellectual capacity, our brain power, outrunning our emotional empathy and ability to say no to ourselves. This is the basic human dilemma. It's not communism or fascism or racism or feminism or the mansphere or all these other iterations that take on extreme forms sometimes. Our basic problem is individual. And that is the question we have to ask ourselves each day as we get carried away by our political enthusiasms, our gender enthusiasms, our class enthusiasm, our race enthusiasm, our identity politics, our Republican or Democratic causes, whatever it may be, and ask ourselves this question, and that is my intellectual capacity, my imagination, outrunning my emotional discipline that can rein in this enthusiasm and put it within the boundaries of what is possible, what is decent, what is acceptable, what is humane? Or will I, like everyone else, just get carried away here in my own enthusiasm, my own selfishness, my own me-ism, concentrating on how I feel rather than how I act when treating other people? I don't have an overarching cosmic answer for why it is, to put it bluntly, evolution screwed up to the extent that we evolved brain capacity and intellectual capacity so far beyond our emotional capacity. Our brain capacity can write a great novel. It can paint a great painting. It can invent the Renaissance and Botticelli and Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci. It can put a rocket on the moon. It can even invent Starlink or Tesla or these other things. But then does the ability to create Tesla or Starlink rein in the emotional capacity and shape the emotional capacity, for instance, to be a sensible person in our own lives when it comes to our own relationships? No. So you see this incredible divide between what I'll call intellectual firepower and basic wisdom. You can have geniuses who can do anything, but in their own personal emotional lives, their own relationships, they trash everything around them. How many great artists in history, or philosophers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau or Picasso, or whomever you want to look at, who left behind this incredible trailblazing work, when you look at their lives and unfold them, in their own lives, they were emotional children, they were toddlers, geniuses who can put up satellite networks and have the intellectual capacity to put the money behind a rocket system which can land again and therefore someday perhaps put humans on Mars and lift huge, heavy loads into space to build a spaceport that can launch from the moon or from an orbiting satellite system people into the far reaches of our own solar system, and yet lacks the emotional capacity to relate to their own children, to maintain a steady relationship with a woman or a man and care for him or her or them in a way that leaves behind something of the fabric of a life well lived. How many lives badly lived by geniuses? What does this say about all of us? Me personally, why can I make commentaries like this about the basic lack of human wisdom to process our intellectual capacity? And yet a few minutes later, over a cup of coffee, get into an argument with my wife, Jeannie. We've been married for 54 years. And snap at her in a way that means that I have to go back and apologize again. Haven't I learned a fucking thing in all these years? Why is my ability to function as a human being on an emotional level so far behind my intellectual ability to read and write and think about things like this commentary I'm making right now? And yet at the same time fall down in exactly the same way everybody else does when it comes to the emotional capacity. Why the 3-year-old inside each of us that can't process our own emotions and selfishness in the context of brain power that can plan a mission to Mars or paint a painting or write a novel? This is the basic human question. I don't have an answer for this. Creation or evolution, however you want to call it, really fucked up. Intelligent design, my ass. Humans only have one problem. Everything else falls by the wayside compared to this. I'm going to say it again. Our intellectual capacity so outruns our emotional ability to deal with that capacity. And that's why every single movement eventually devolves into extremism. Do we learn and next time around get it better? No, we do not. The cycle continues. In the far reach of evolution, given another 100,000 years of human existence, if we are so lucky, will we get there? Maybe. Maybe we're just in the middle of an evolutionary state in which our capacity intellectually to reason has yet to have the emotional capacity to handle that ability catch up with it. I don't know, but I do have a kind of Band-Aid solution for the moment. Be aware of that problem in your own life. I cannot fix the world's problems, but I can be aware that my emotional capacity and empathy is so outrun by my intellectual ability, like everybody else, that I can get carried away and not concentrate on what's right in front of me because I'm so interested in the big intellectual questions. Let's solve world hunger or ecological disaster or empower all women or solve racism or quit oppressing people. And yet forget to get up a little earlier this morning and do the dishes so my companion for 54 years has a better day. And yet forget that my grandchildren who live nearby need me. They don't need someone to solve global hunger. They need me right now to come down to the high school where they go and pick them up early because they're not feeling well that day. They need to know that they have the unconditional love of a grandfather. That I can do. So I would just call on anybody listening to this to step back, take a deep breath, and understand that no matter how politics go and how we win the next election, or whether we have a great novel in us or writing something, or the Health and Human Services Department we're reorganizing, or the motherhood we are practicing, or the fatherhood or the grandparenthood, the bottom line is we can't solve this problem, this dichotomy between our intellectual capacity and our emotional reserves to handle that capacity. So what we can do is make that an issue in our own lives and decide that we are going to make a project out of admitting the fact that our intellectual ability outruns our emotional capacity to handle that ability. And by naming that problem, not solve that problem for all of humanity, but behave better ourselves. And instead of thinking about the intellectual capacity of ideas and getting everything right and thinking correctly about things, realize that those are irresolvable problems. You will not find the solution. But you can pause to talk to a neighbor. You can treat your companion, your wife, your husband, your lover with more decency. You can concentrate more on being a polite friend than a goddamn genius. if I can put it that way. You can see your life in bite-sized pieces of relationships that you can make flourish whether we solve all the problems or not. That's a project that we can all handle, but it starts with admitting, once again, that our intellectual capacity has far out-evolved our emotional capacity to handle those abilities. Let's look at life in bite-sized pieces and start treating the people around us with more decency. My name is Frank Schaefer.